There's one episode of Little House on the Prairie that Melissa Sue Anderson cannot bring herself to watch. Not now, not ever. Decades have passed. The series has become a cherished piece of television history, yet this single episode remains locked away in her memory like a sealed room she refuses to enter. Behind the show's sunlit fields and gentle music was a moment of pure devastation. A storyline so intense it shattered the illusion of safety the series had built for years. It left viewers stunned, the cast shaken, and Anderson herself emotionally scarred by what she was asked to live through on screen. What aired that night in 1980 was unlike anything the series or its audience had faced before. Why does this episode still haunt her? What unfolded behind the scenes that made it impossible for her to revisit? And why, even now, does Melissa Sue Anderson turn away from the episode that changed Little House on the Prairie forever? A moment burned so deeply into her past that she's never looked back. When Little House on the Prairie premiered in the mid-1970s, it quickly became one of America's most beloved television dramas. Set against the wide skies and open fields of Walnut Grove, it offered viewers a comforting vision of family, faith, and resilience. For millions, tuning in each week wasn't just entertainment, it was a ritual. At the heart of this world was Mary Ingalls, played by Melissa Sue Anderson, while Michael Landon anchored the series as Charles, and Laura's adventures gave the show its youthful spark. Mary carried a different emotional weight. Her storylines often explored themes the series rarely confronted elsewhere: illness, loss, isolation, and survival. When Mary went blind in Season 4, it was a seismic moment for the show. Audiences watched a young girl lose her sight, struggle to adapt, and ultimately forge a new identity. It was raw, emotional storytelling that stood apart from typical family television of the era. Anderson's performance drew widespread praise. She was calm, controlled, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. Even as a teenager, she portrayed Mary's inner strength with a gravity that older actors might have struggled to match. Over time, she became the emotional anchor of the series, grounding its more dramatic storylines with quiet authenticity. For many fans, her presence represented the heart of Little House, a figure who endured unimaginable hardship, but carried on with dignity. Behind the scenes, Michael Landon recognized the power of Anderson's performances. He wrote storylines that pushed Mary further than most characters would ever go, testing both her resilience and Anderson's abilities. By Season 6, she had gone from a girl in a prairie town to a young woman living at a blind school, married to Adam Kendall, and facing adult challenges that mirrored real-world tragedies. This evolution mirrored the show's own growth. As Little House matured, so did its narratives. Early seasons focused on simpler moral lessons and small-town dramas, but by the late 1970s, the writers weren't afraid to tackle darker, more complex themes. They wanted the series to feel more emotionally real, to reflect the pain and joy of frontier life in equal measure. Anderson, with her quiet intensity, was often at the center of these pivotal moments. The result was a deep bond between viewers and Mary Ingalls. Fans cried with her, rooted for her, and felt protective of her. She was no longer just Laura's older sister. She had become a symbol of endurance. But this same bond made what came next all the more devastating. In 1980, a single episode would take Mary's world and the series itself into territory no one had fully anticipated. For Melissa Sue Anderson, that turning point would leave a mark she could never erase. By the time Season 6 arrived, Little House on the Prairie had entered a new chapter. The familiar rhythms of Walnut Grove were still there. The schoolhouse, the church, the shared community spirit, but many of the characters had grown up, and their lives had shifted into more complex territory. For Mary Ingalls, this meant stepping into adulthood while carrying the heavy burden of blindness. Her move to the blind school with Adam Kendall marked a clear departure from the earlier years of prairie adventures and childish rivalries. Now her world revolved around responsibility, perseverance, and the fragile hope of building a life in a place designed to give people like her a chance at independence. The blind school itself was unlike anything viewers had seen on the show before. It wasn't just a backdrop, it was a community within a community, filled with students and teachers who lived with real vulnerability. Mary's marriage to Adam had given her a sense of purpose, and together they worked to create a haven for the blind, a space where dignity and courage were woven into daily life. For a time it seemed that Mary's story had settled into a quiet rhythm, difficult but hopeful, mature but stable. Yet beneath this sense of calm, the writers were preparing to push the story into darker emotional terrain. Season 6 wasn't just about expanding Mary's world. It was about testing its foundations. The blind school had become a symbol of resilience, but symbols are fragile. In a single moment, everything that Mary had built was about to be torn apart. The seeds of tragedy were planted subtly. Albert Ingalls and his friend, both curious and mischievous, spent more and more time around the school. Their presence brought a lighter, youthful energy, but it also introduced elements of unpredictability. Their curiosity wasn't malicious, it was childlike, but in a setting where safety depended on structure and caution, even the smallest mistake could have devastating consequences. As the season progressed, episodes hinted at shifting dynamics. Mary and Adam's lives were busier. The school had more students. There was an unspoken sense that something monumental was approaching, a narrative drumbeat growing louder beneath the surface. Viewers couldn't have known it then, but the creative team had decided that the blind school, the place where Mary had found hope, would also become the stage for her most crushing heartbreak. When the story for May We Make Them Proud was finalized, it wasn't framed as a typical episode. It was a two-part event, a centerpiece for the season. It would begin with a moment of innocence and end in irreversible loss. In doing so, the series would cross a threshold it could never step back over. For Mary Ingalls, the blind school represented her greatest triumph. Soon it would become the setting of her deepest pain. On a cold evening in 1980, viewers tuned in expecting another emotional but familiar chapter of Little House on the Prairie. What they witnessed instead was a sequence unlike anything the show had attempted before. The episode May We Make Them Proud began quietly. Albert and a friend sneaked into the basement of the blind school, curious and carefree, lighting a pipe they didn't fully understand. In seconds, their small act set in motion a catastrophe. Flames caught, smoke spread, and in an instant, the sanctuary Mary Ingalls had helped build became a burning trap. For audiences, the fire sequence was harrowing. The camera followed as chaos erupted inside the blind school, students and teachers panicking in the dark, unable to see or find their way. The frantic sound of crackling wood and desperate cries filled the scene. At the center of it all was Alice Garvey, clutching Mary's baby, trying to escape the encroaching flames. When she realized there was no way out, she smashed a window in one final act of courage. The explosion of fire that followed, swallowing her and the child, stunned viewers. It was brutal, tragic, and unforgettable. Behind the camera, Melissa Sue Anderson wasn't just acting through another dramatic moment. She was being pushed to deliver one of the most emotionally intense performances of her career. Her character wasn't inside the building when the fire started, but when Mary learned the truth, when she realized that her baby had died, Anderson had to embody a level of shock and grief rarely seen on family television. These weren't scenes she could ease into. They demanded immediate emotional immersion, sustained for multiple takes, under the watchful eye of Michael Landon, who directed with meticulous precision. The fire sequences themselves were filmed with practical effects. Real flames filled the set, carefully controlled by the crew but still unpredictable. Actors had to perform surrounded by heat, smoke, and rapidly changing conditions. For Anderson, it meant standing just beyond the chaos, knowing she would have to react to it with complete authenticity. Co-stars later recalled how intense the atmosphere was on set. No laughter between takes, no casual chatter. Everyone understood they were filming something different, something that carried real weight. When it came time for Mary's breakdown, Anderson had one chance to get it right. Her scream, her collapse, her raw disbelief, none of it was staged with safety nets. The camera rolled and she poured every ounce of emotion into that moment. Crew members later described the silence that followed as chilling. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like watching someone break. Audiences saw a powerful scene of tragedy. Melissa Sue Anderson lived it, surrounded by real flames and heavy expectations, giving everything she had to a moment she would never willingly revisit again. When the cameras finally stopped rolling on May We Make Them Proud, the atmosphere on set was nothing like a typical wrap. Usually, after an intense sequence, there would be nervous laughter, light chatter, or crew members releasing the tension that had built up during filming. This time, there was none of that. The cast and crew emerged from the smoke-filled set in near silence, drained by what they had just created. Even seasoned crew members, accustomed to dramatic storylines and emotional beats, walked away shaken. The scale of the fire sequence and the raw performances had left an unexpected heaviness hanging in the air. For Melissa Sue Anderson, that weight settled even deeper. She had just delivered one of the most demanding scenes of her career, a performance that required her to inhabit Mary Ingalls' grief without any emotional buffer. In the moment, there was no separation between character and actress. She wasn't replaying lines or adjusting gestures. She was living through a devastating loss, as the cameras captured every flicker of pain. Once the scene was done, stepping out of that state wasn't simple. She didn't have the luxury of walking off set and leaving Mary's anguish behind. The intensity lingered. Colleagues noticed the change immediately. Anderson, usually composed and professional, grew quiet. She withdrew between takes in the days that followed, avoiding conversation about the fire sequence. Cast members would later recall how she seemed emotionally spent, as if she'd given a part of herself to the role and wasn't sure how to get it back. This wasn't the kind of scene one could laugh off at lunch or shrug away after the director called cut. It left a mark. The emotional residue extended beyond the set. Filming May We Make Them Proud didn't happen in a single day. It stretched over a demanding schedule. Each return to the storyline meant reopening that wound. Anderson had to carry Mary's heartbreak through multiple scenes that explored the aftermath of the tragedy. Conversations, quiet moments, lingering grief. Unlike action sequences that could be reset and repeated, these emotional beats required consistent depth. By the end, she wasn't just tired, she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. Michael Landon's creative approach intensified this effect. He valued authenticity above all else, pushing his actors to inhabit their roles fully. For Anderson, this meant little room for detachment. She rose to the challenge, but privately she began to pull back from the idea of ever revisiting what she'd filmed. The experience was too raw, too closely tied to her emotional state at that point in her life. When filming wrapped, the rest of the cast slowly returned to their routines. For Anderson, though, something had shifted permanently. The episode had demanded more from her than any other, and even as the show moved forward, that chapter remained closed in her mind. What audiences would watch on screen was finished, edited and broadcast. What she carried afterward wasn't. Long after the episode aired, fans continued to talk about May We Make Them Proud. Many remembered exactly where they were when they first saw it. Some recalled crying openly in their living rooms. Others spoke about how the fire sequence haunted them well into adulthood. For viewers, it was a powerful piece of television that pushed emotional boundaries. But for Melissa Sue Anderson, it represented something entirely different. It wasn't just a difficult episode, it was a line she chose never to cross again. In interviews over the years, Anderson has spoken sparingly about this storyline. She has acknowledged its significance to the show and to her character, but she has also been clear that she's never sat down to rewatch it. The reason isn't rooted in criticism of the writing or production. It comes from the intensity of what she experienced while filming. The emotions she accessed were real, and revisiting them on screen would mean reopening a place she deliberately closed off. For her, watching that episode wouldn't be a nostalgic trip. It would be a return to something she endured rather than simply performed. There's also a deeper layer to consider. At the time, child and young adult actors were rarely offered emotional support or guidance through such heavy material. They were expected to rise to the occasion and move on. Anderson was still very young when she filmed this episode. Yet she was carrying the emotional core of a tragedy that would have challenged any adult actor. Once the cameras stopped, there wasn't a structured way to process the intensity. Choosing not to revisit the episode became her own quiet form of protection. Her decision also reflects how deeply she separated her personal self from the role once filming ended. Mary Ingalls had been at the center of some of the show's most devastating moments, and Anderson had given everything to make those moments feel real. But she wasn't Mary. She didn't want to relive the trauma of that storyline as a spectator. To watch it now would mean watching her younger self break down on screen with genuine grief, and that's not something she's ever wanted to witness from the outside. Fans have sometimes expressed surprise at her stance. For many, these episodes are treasured pieces of television history. They rewatch them for comfort, nostalgia, or the sheer emotional impact. Anderson's refusal stands in contrast, highlighting the difference between viewing a story and living it from the inside out. What moved audiences to tears once is what she had to inhabit fully, without distance, at a formative moment in her life. Decades later, she's never wavered from that choice. The episode remains part of her legacy, but it's not part of her personal reflection. For her, leaving it unwatched isn't about denial, it's about self-preservation. When May We Make Them Proud aired, it didn't just affect viewers emotionally for one night. It altered the way audiences experienced the series from that point forward. Until then, Little House on the Prairie had walked a careful line between hardship and hope. The show had never shied away from portraying loss or struggle, but those storylines were often balanced with redemption, moral clarity, and the comforting rhythms of prairie life. This episode broke that rhythm. It introduced a level of devastation that felt irreversible, and once that door was opened, the show itself couldn't fully return to the innocence it once carried. The fire at the blind school wasn't just another plot twist. It was a deliberate narrative turning point. The writers and Michael Landon had chosen to place one of the show's most hopeful settings at the center of a tragedy. By destroying the place where Mary Ingalls had built her new life, they dismantled more than a building. They changed the emotional landscape of the series. The show that began with a wagon rolling across open fields was now contending with the permanence of death, the unpredictability of disaster, and the long shadow those things cast. In the seasons that followed, subtle shifts became visible. Storylines leaned into heavier territory more frequently. The moral lessons remained, but they were often framed within darker circumstances, accidents, illnesses, and personal losses that didn't always end neatly. Viewers who had grown up alongside the Ingalls family were maturing too, and the show reflected that evolution. But for many longtime fans, May We Make Them Proud stood out as the moment when the emotional temperature changed. It wasn't just sad, it was unforgettable. The cast felt the shift as well. For younger actors who had come of age on the show, this episode signaled that Little House was entering a more serious phase. Melissa Sue Anderson's performance set a new standard for emotional depth, and it raised expectations for the kind of storytelling the series could tackle. Her portrayal of Mary's grief became a benchmark, an unspoken reminder of how far the show was willing to go. Culturally, the episode earned a unique place in television history. Family dramas of the era rarely took such bold risks. Episodes involving death often occurred off-screen, softened by narration or moral lessons delivered in hindsight. Little House did the opposite. It placed viewers in the middle of the event and let them feel its chaos and weight. That choice distinguished the series from many of its contemporaries and deepened its cultural footprint. In hindsight, this single storyline became more than just a pivotal plot. It was a creative gamble that redefined the show's identity. For audiences, it proved that Little House on the Prairie was capable of confronting real darkness. For the cast, it became a shared moment of reckoning. And for Melissa Sue Anderson, it remained a threshold she would never step back through. More than 4 decades have passed since May We Make Them Proud first aired, yet its shadow remains. For many fans, that episode isn't simply part of the show's history, it's a moment permanently etched into their memories. Viewers who grew up watching Little House on the Prairie often recall this storyline with striking clarity. Some describe the fire sequence as the first time a television show genuinely unsettled them. Others remember the silence in their living rooms when the credits rolled, a stunned quiet that mirrored the mood on set after filming. It wasn't just another episode, it was the one that changed how people felt about the series forever. Melissa Sue Anderson has maintained a quiet distance from that legacy. She has spoken openly about her years on the show, reflected on her character's growth, and acknowledged the significance of key storylines. Yet when it comes to this particular episode, she's chosen restraint. She hasn't revisited it in anniversary specials, hasn't offered scene-by-scene commentary, and hasn't indulged in nostalgic rewatch moments that many of her co-stars have embraced. Her silence isn't rooted in bitterness. It's a kind of boundary, one that has remained intact through interviews, fan events, and retrospectives. That boundary has in its own way deepened the aura surrounding the episode. The fact that the actress who delivered its most unforgettable performance has never looked back adds a quiet weight to the story. It reminds fans that what they experienced emotionally as viewers was only a fraction of what the cast lived through to bring it to life. Her decision not to revisit it is both personal and symbolic. It speaks to the power of storytelling that can leave lasting marks not just on audiences but on the people who create it. The episode's legacy has also endured through cultural conversations about television history. Critics and historians often point to May We Make Them Proud as one of the earliest examples of a family drama confronting tragedy with unflinching realism. It showed that television aimed at broad audiences could be emotionally devastating and artistically daring without losing its moral core. Its impact has outlived trends, remakes, and changing viewing habits. New generations discover it through reruns and streaming, often reacting the same way audiences did in 1980, with shock, empathy, and a lingering sense of grief. Melissa Sue Anderson's refusal to revisit the episode has become part of that legacy. Her silence isn't absence, it's presence of a different kind. It acknowledges the weight of the moment without needing to relive it. For fans, that choice feels almost fitting. The episode that burned itself into the collective memory of viewers also carved a place in the personal history of the actress at its center. It remains untouched, preserved in time both on screen and within her own boundaries. May We Make Them Proud stands as more than just a pivotal episode of Little House on the Prairie. It's a moment where storytelling, performance, and raw human emotion converged to create something unforgettable. For fans, it remains one of television's most haunting memories. For Melissa Sue Anderson, it's a place she's chosen never to return to. Her silence over the years isn't an oversight, it's a quiet acknowledgement of how deeply that storyline affected her, not just as an actress, but as a young woman asked to inhabit immense grief for the sake of a performance. Time has only strengthened the episode's impact. Viewers still revisit it with tears, and scholars still cite it as a turning point in television history. Anderson's decision not to rewatch it has become part of its power. A reminder that some stories live on precisely because they're left untouched. For more emotional stories, check out this video.